10:02 a.m., the federal courtroom was packed. No one expected this day to become the pivotal moment that would go down in history. On the defendant's bench sat an ordinary journalist accused of defamation. At the defense table, Karoline Leavitt, no law degree, no admission to the bar, no legal right to represent anyone in court. Judge Martin Eldridge smirked when he saw her. He had no idea that standing before him was someone capable of quoting, word for word, the very section of the Constitution he himself had violated. He didn't know that this woman knew more than most credentialed attorneys in Washington, and he certainly didn't know that in just 27 minutes, he would leave the courtroom to the sound of applause, and not in his honor. The courtroom was unusually full for a morning hearing, buzzing with the quiet tension of press, whispers, and clicking pens. Everyone had shown up early, expecting something, though no one could quite say what. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, tall and composed in a magenta blazer that clashed vividly with the muted browns of the polished wood walls. Her presence was deliberate, defiant even, as she stepped past the security rail and positioned herself at the defense table. No one had expected her to be there, least of all Judge Eldridge, who sat elevated at the bench, reviewing papers with a smirk already creeping onto his face before he even looked up to see her. She wasn't supposed to be defending this case. In fact, she wasn't supposed to be there at all. Karoline had no law degree, no license, no legal precedent to stand on, just the stubborn conviction that the defendant, an independent journalist named Greg Hadley, had been railroaded by a court order aimed more at silencing him than pursuing justice. And so she showed up, uninvited and unafraid, ready to challenge not only a seasoned prosecutor, but the entire judicial process. As the court came to order, murmurs began to spread. Some recognized her from television. Others whispered half-truths about her time in Washington, her controversial press briefings, her sharp tongue that had once put even seasoned reporters in their place. But this was different. This wasn't a camera-ready podium or spin room. This was a federal courtroom, and here, the rules were written in Latin and precedent, not in tweets or press releases. From the bench, Judge Eldridge gave her the kind of look reserved for insolent interns or disruptive activists. Half amused, half disgusted. The air was thick with unspoken judgment. One could almost hear the condescension before he spoke. There was a quiet exchange between the bailiff and the clerk. Papers were passed, eyebrows raised. Karoline remained still. Her eyes didn't dart around the room. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile. She simply waited. That waiting, that stillness, only made the room more restless. In the first row, the prosecution team leaned into each other, clearly entertained. One of them snorted under his breath, barely concealing a grin. They weren't just skeptical, they were mocking her. To them, this was a joke, a morning detour, a performance. There was a hierarchy in that room, and Karoline, without a degree, without robes, without their language of legalese, wasn't part of it. As the judge began his opening remarks, his tone danced between official protocol and thinly veiled sarcasm. Every sentence he directed toward her came laced with disbelief and performative politeness, as if addressing a child who had wandered into a restricted area. The gallery chuckled. The press scribbled faster. Even the defendant, sitting quietly beside her, looked uncertain. She could feel his nervous glances, unsure if placing his faith in her was an act of bravery or madness. She knew what they were thinking. She was a joke. She was there to make a point, not a case. She wasn't one of them. She didn't belong in their world of Latin maxims and courtroom etiquette, of objections and sustains, of carved seals and case numbers. She was a mouthpiece, a public figure, a TV personality with too much confidence and not enough credentials. But she didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't push back. Not yet. She let them believe what they wanted to believe. Let them laugh. Let them roll their eyes and whisper and smirk and sneer. Because all of it, their dismissal, their arrogance, their contempt, was part of the script they had rehearsed all their lives. It never occurred to them that someone outside their script might not only know how it ends, but might have written an entirely different one. Karoline stood with her hands lightly folded, posture tall, eyes ahead. The judge questioned her right to be there, made her state her non-credentials for the record, ensured that every spectator and every camera had a clear record of her lack of legal standing. He repeated it 3 times: no law degree, no license to practice, no official counsel status, just representing voluntarily for a client who had been denied proper defense, just making a statement, as the judge called it, with audible irritation. He laughed once, softly, not enough to be noted by the court recorder, but loud enough to ripple through the audience. That laugh was the permission everyone else needed. The prosecutor chuckled openly. A woman in the third row smirked and whispered to her companion. The stenographer's fingers hesitated for a moment, then resumed. The room was thick with condescension, with the arrogance of men who thought they understood the battlefield and had already won. Karoline said nothing. Not yet. Her silence, steady and calculated, rang louder than the murmurs. Because what they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly anticipate, was that Karoline Leavitt had memorized the Constitution not out of necessity, but out of reverence. That behind her composed expression and immovable stance lay hours, days, months of obsessive study, of quiet preparation, of fire she had taught herself to contain. And though they couldn't see it yet, though they were too busy laughing to notice, the reckoning had already begun. The room had settled into a rhythm of quiet mockery and bureaucratic ceremony. Papers shuffled, keys clicked on courtroom laptops. The dull murmur of gallery chatter filled the background like white noise, all while Karoline Leavitt stood motionless at the defense table. The smirks hadn't faded yet. If anything, they had deepened. She could feel the judgment not just in words but in posture, in the crossed arms, the tilted heads, the slight shake of the judge's hand as he rifled through her submitted motion, clearly not taking it seriously. She watched everything, not with fear or even irritation, but with that calm, watchful awareness that made people deeply uncomfortable when they were the subject of it. Her eyes didn't dart around the room in panic or doubt. They moved slowly, intentionally. Every movement was deliberate, every blink measured. She looked at the judge, then at the jury box, then at the prosecution team, and finally at the audience seated behind her. She was studying them all, cataloging the assumptions in their faces, the smirking certainty in their expressions that this would be over soon, that she wouldn't last past the first objection, that this was just another political stunt from someone too proud to know their place. She didn't adjust her stance. She didn't touch her hair. She didn't glance down at her notes. She stood as still as a monument, as if carved from resolve itself. And yet something had begun to shift, almost imperceptibly. The more she didn't react, the more the room began to tense in tiny, barely visible ways. The prosecutor's fingers tapped the desk a little faster. A law clerk behind the bench whispered something to a colleague and kept looking her way. The court reporter hesitated before typing again. It wasn't what she said. It was what she hadn't said. The lack of protest, the absence of emotional defense, the refusal to shrink or apologize had unsettled something in them. In that silence, Karoline retreated inward. Behind her stillness, her mind moved with sharp precision. She wasn't thinking about what they were saying. She had anticipated every insult, every accusation of incompetence, every accusation that she was trespassing in a room meant for real lawyers. What she was thinking about now was timing, about control, about when, not if, to strike. The structure of her strategy was already complete in her mind, chaptered like a story, footnoted with precedents, annotated with sections of the Constitution she had committed to memory, not out of necessity, but out of pure, driven discipline. She wasn't improvising. She had been preparing for this moment long before any of them knew this case existed. She knew the names of the clerk's assistants. She knew the judge's previous rulings, including one that had been quietly reversed on appeal. She knew the prosecuting attorney's law school, his graduation ranking, and the editorial he had written 10 years ago that contradicted the position he was taking today. None of these were part of her opening argument. They didn't need to be. They were tools she would use only if required. She had come not just to win, but to expose, to make visible the rot beneath the procedures, the fragility behind the arrogance. And still she waited. She allowed the silence to stretch. The court's usual tempo, its rhythm of questions, answers, interruptions, and corrections, was disrupted. The absence of noise had become louder than the gavel. No one could quite place the feeling that crept in. No one could articulate the tension that began to replace the initial laughter. But it was there, creeping in through the floorboards, humming in the lighting fixtures, vibrating in the pen the judge held between two fingers but hadn't used in minutes. Caroline's stare moved back to the judge. Her eyes didn't challenge him directly. They simply held their place, not to confront, but to remind. She was still there. She hadn't moved. She hadn't folded. That fact alone was its own statement. One of the younger interns seated behind the prosecution leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. He'd seen that look before. Not from politicians or lawyers, but from chess players. The ones who had already seen 10 moves ahead while their opponents were still admiring their own opening gambit. In the audience, a local journalist adjusted his camera angle. He didn't know why yet, but something told him this hearing wouldn't go the way people thought. The way Karoline stood, the way she seemed to contain so much energy beneath so little movement, felt like the start of a story, not the footnote to one. Still, the judge continued his remarks, setting ground rules, issuing procedural reminders, repeating phrases from memory that meant little in the moment. But even his voice had changed. Slightly, subtly. There was an edge of frustration, of irritation that his tone couldn't quite disguise. It was in the way he emphasized the word voluntary, as if her presence were a nuisance to the process. It was in the way he pretended not to look at her directly when referencing the defense. But Karoline noticed. She noticed everything, not out of paranoia, but out of training. Years of watching how narratives were built, how power disguised itself as protocol. The prosecution smirked again. The lead attorney whispered something to his colleague, and they both smiled. Their confidence was undisturbed. They still believed they were in control. Karoline didn't correct them. Not yet. The worst thing she could do to them was nothing. The most powerful move she could make was to let them believe she had none. Time moved differently now. Minutes felt like prelude. The entire courtroom was caught in a moment that no one wanted to acknowledge was no longer routine. Something was happening. They just didn't know what it was yet. Karoline knew. She could feel it in the way her heartbeat stayed steady, in the precision of her breath, in the cold focus of her thoughts. She wasn't preparing anymore. She was simply waiting, letting the weight of their assumptions do the damage for her. It would only take one sentence to shift everything, one precise line. She wasn't there to shout it. She was there to deliver it at the right moment, with the exact balance of logic and fury, clarity and finality. And when that moment came, they wouldn't be able to laugh anymore. They wouldn't even remember how they did. The moment arrived not with fanfare, but with the most ordinary of triggers, an offhand remark casually delivered by the prosecuting attorney as he reviewed the opening statement. His voice carried the tone of someone who believed the case was already decided, who considered the entire proceeding little more than a formality to be filed and forgotten. He gestured lazily toward the defendant and made a dismissive reference to the defense's qualifications, or lack thereof. Laughter flickered in the gallery again, short and sharp, like sparks from a dying fire. The judge didn't bother to intervene. If anything, his faint smirk indicated approval. The balance of the room tilted ever so slightly further toward mockery, and for a split second, it seemed the momentum would lock into place. But then Karoline spoke. Her voice was calm, unhurried, yet unmistakably clear. There was no hesitation, no tremor, no falter in her tone. She didn't raise her voice, didn't alter her posture, didn't seek attention, but attention found her anyway. She began not with emotion, but with precision, with the language of law. The room shifted as if gravity had subtly realigned. She referenced a statute, not just quoted it, invoked it with context, with historical framing, with a level of fluency that froze the smirks in mid-formation. She named a legal precedent, then another, building an architecture of meaning that none of them expected her to possess. For a second, there was silence. Not the bored quiet of bureaucratic routine, but the focused stillness of sudden awareness. The kind of silence that follows a realization too loud to speak aloud. Karoline continued, never looking down, never referencing a single note. Her words were not memorized, they were lived. internalized. Her command of the material was total, not because she had been trained in the traditional sense, but because she had trained herself in the margins where others had dismissed her. Her education hadn't come from institutions, but from obsession, from hunger, from the sharp, driving refusal to be underestimated. The judge blinked once, then again. His pen had stopped moving, hovering in his hand like a relic from a former reality. Across the room, the prosecutor shifted in his seat. No more whispering, no more chuckling. The defense table had transformed in an instant from a stage of embarrassment to a platform of authority, and it happened without permission. Karoline didn't ask for the floor. She took it with the weight of her knowledge and the force of her clarity. She dissected the prosecution's framing point by point, not with indignation, but with clinical disassembly. Each argument they had leaned on collapsed under her citations, her interpretations, her ability to weave together legal reasoning with constitutional principle. Her cadence was deliberate, her phrasing surgical. Every sentence added weight, built pressure, redefined the narrative. She wasn't defending a man accused of defamation. She was exposing the mechanisms of overreach, of selective enforcement, of the chilling effect on speech when power is left unchecked. People started leaning forward in their seats. Reporters stopped typing and just listened. A court officer glanced at another, eyebrows slightly raised. Even the clerk, long practiced at tuning out the noise of hearings, was now fully engaged, eyes fixed on Karoline as if seeing her for the first time. Something had broken loose in the room, something that could not be ignored or suppressed. The assumption of incompetence was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous to the prosecution: credibility. Karoline's voice never wavered. She knew exactly how much to reveal and how much to hold back. She offered just enough depth to prove her point, but left the deeper corridors of her preparation hidden for now. This was only the opening. She didn't need to win the trial in one statement. She only needed to unseat their certainty, to force them to reckon with the possibility that they had misjudged her, underestimated her, and, in doing so, made themselves vulnerable. She ended her remarks with a quiet assertion, a line so fundamentally rooted in law that even the judge could not immediately contest it. Her delivery was flawless, not because it was rehearsed, but because it was true. She spoke not from notes, but from conviction, not from posture, but from principle. The moment she stopped speaking, the silence returned. But this time it was different. It was heavy, dense with recalibration. The prosecutor cleared his throat and mumbled a procedural objection, but the sound fell flat. It wasn't just that Karoline had spoken well, it was that she had introduced a new gravity to the room. The mood had shifted, and everyone felt it. The courtroom was no longer a space of performance for those in robes and suits. It had become a stage where legitimacy had to be earned in real time. And Karoline had just done that. The judge glanced down at his notes as if seeing them for the first time. There was no rebuke, no attempt to reassert control. Not yet. He remained silent, perhaps out of prudence, perhaps out of pride. But the calculation behind his eyes had changed. He was reassessing, reframing, trying to fit this version of Karoline into the script he had written in his head. And he couldn't, because she no longer fit within it. The moment passed without a gavel, without a ruling, without a decision. But the damage had been done. The prosecution team looked at one another, searching for a thread to pull that could unravel what had just occurred. There wasn't one. Karoline had landed the first blow. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, but it was undeniable. And it echoed through the courtroom louder than any shout could have. There was a different kind of quiet in the courtroom now. Not the passive stillness of routine, but the brittle, breath-held silence that falls before something inevitable. Karoline stood precisely where she had been since the beginning, but the perception of her had changed entirely. She was no longer an anomaly in the room. She had become its axis. And though the prosecution attempted to reassert the narrative, speaking with forced confidence, referencing standard precedents and tried-and-true tactics, none of it landed with the authority it once held. The shift in power was subtle, but it had weight. Eyes that had once looked through her now watched her. Doubts that had once belonged to her now hung in the air above the state's case. And yet Karoline said nothing more for the moment. She let the tension build, let their discomfort deepen. She understood timing as well as she understood law, maybe even better. There was a rhythm to moments like this, and she was listening for the exact beat when the room would be most receptive, when the doubt had fully bloomed, and all that remained was the strike. So she waited, calm, composed, and then she reached into the folder she had brought with her. It wasn't thick. No dramatic binders or stacks of evidence, just one document, one thin piece of paper, well worn at the edges, unfolded with deliberate care. She held it up without flourish, simply placed it on the defense table and slid it toward the judge's clerk. The room shifted again. The sound of the paper against the polished wood was soft, but it carried. The judge leaned forward slightly, curiosity overtaking disdain. The clerk read it first, her brows knitting together almost immediately. Then she passed it forward, and as the judge's eyes moved down the page, line by line, a slow transformation came over his face. It was not surprise, it was recognition. The document was a court order, signed 6 months prior, an injunction filed against the very same journalist who now sat beside Karoline. It had barred him from publishing a piece about a government contract awarded under questionable terms. The rationale had been framed in national security language, but upon inspection, it was legally flimsy, so much so that it had drawn quiet criticism even within judicial circles. What the judge now held in his hands, however, was not merely a copy of that order. It was an annotated breakdown, line by line, citing every constitutional conflict embedded within it. And at the bottom, in crisp ink, was his own signature. It wasn't the existence of the document that changed the temperature of the room. It was what Karoline had done to it. She had dissected his decision, exposed its inconsistencies, its overreach, and had aligned each point with a corresponding passage from the Constitution. The annotations weren't opinionated or theatrical. They were methodical, clean, unassailable. They spoke not of someone challenging the system out of defiance, but someone defending it with a level of reverence far deeper than the man who had once authored the very order she now tore apart. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The judge was reading his own words reflected back at him in a mirror sharper than any cross-examination. The gallery remained silent, the tension so tight it felt like the room itself might snap. Even the prosecutor was still, frozen somewhere between indignation and confusion. He had known the document existed. He had helped argue for it, but he hadn't expected it to resurface like this, in this setting, reframed not as a legal maneuver, but as a betrayal of the very Constitution he claimed to defend. Karoline finally moved, not toward the judge, but toward the jury box, which sat empty but symbolically present. She placed a second copy of the document on the edge of the stand, a quiet gesture that transformed the courtroom from a procedural space into a theater of accountability. She then turned and walked back to the defense table, every step echoing with a gravity that no one could deny. She didn't ask for a ruling. She didn't demand a response. She had already made her point. It was in this moment that the full magnitude of her presence crystallized. She was not just arguing the law, she was holding a mirror up to the very people who had sworn to uphold it, and they didn't like what they saw. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His voice, when it returned, was stripped of its earlier arrogance. He asked procedural questions, clarified minor points, but never challenged the foundation of what had been presented. Because he couldn't. The document didn't lie. It was his. But seen through Karoline's lens, it had become something else entirely. Evidence not of law, but of its erosion. Somewhere in the back of the room, a reporter began to write faster, as if realizing that the headline had just changed. The defense was no longer the underdog. It had become the conscience of the court. And Karoline Leavitt, once dismissed as a political ornament, now stood as a constitutional guardian in the one place they had tried to deny her entry. She resumed her position at the table, hands resting lightly on the surface. Her face revealed nothing, but her silence roared. The prosecution sat still, trying to find a thread to pull that would unravel what had just occurred. But none existed. This wasn't about one case or one journalist anymore. It had become a referendum on the court itself, and the judge knew it. What Karoline had just done wasn't simply a clever tactic or a dramatic reveal. It was an unmasking, a surgical exposure of how authority can be weaponized when no one is brave enough to confront it. She had confronted it, not with anger but with accuracy, not with defiance but with discipline. And the room which had once dismissed her now hung on her every unspoken word. The unraveling had begun, not of her case, but of theirs. And she hadn't even raised her voice. It did not happen all at once. There was no thunderclap, no dramatic collapse of the opposition. The destruction was incremental, measured, exact, deliberate. It unfolded not in shouting or spectacle, but in the quiet unraveling of confidence, in the slow realization that the power structure in the room had shifted and could no longer be explained away. Karoline Leavitt had passed the point of proving herself. Now she was dismantling the very scaffolding that had upheld the prosecution's narrative, and she was doing it without raising her voice or even altering the calm, surgical cadence that had defined her every move. The judge, still trying to maintain composure, attempted to redirect the proceeding toward procedure, asking clipped questions, requesting clarifications, but it was too late. Every time Karoline responded, her tone steady and composed, she reasserted her command of the facts, not just the facts of the case, but of the legal framework surrounding it. She cited precedent the prosecution had overlooked. She referenced clauses that were obscure even to seasoned attorneys. She connected statutes in ways that exposed contradictions in the opposing counsel's argument. Each point landed with precision, not as accusations, but as undeniable truths. And then, as if tightening the final bolts around the structure she had built, she returned to the core of the prosecution's claim that the journalist had violated court orders and endangered national security by publishing restricted information. Karoline did not refute the act itself. Instead, she attacked the very foundation of the injunction, its constitutionality, its origin, and its selective enforcement. She showed methodically that similar cases had been dismissed under broader protections of the First Amendment. She referenced the language of the Constitution, quoting it line by line, not with the rote memory of someone performing for approval, but with the weight of someone who had internalized every word. Her voice, though never rising, became a force in the room. It was the kind of force that didn't overwhelm but destabilized, quietly removing the floor beneath those who thought themselves untouchable. The prosecutor began to object more frequently now, his voice sharper, more defensive. But his protests lacked the crispness they once had. They were reactive, scrambling. His objections weren't just overruled, they were ignored by a room that no longer respected the authority he once carried. He knew it too. It was in the way he reached for papers he didn't need, the way he glanced at the judge looking for support and found only polite neutrality. Karoline moved forward with relentless calm, her words cutting deeper precisely because they were unadorned. There was no drama in her delivery, no appeal to emotion. It was pure logic, delivered with the weight of truth. When she revisited the judge's previous ruling, the very one he had signed and that she had exposed, she did so not with condemnation, but with illumination. She showed how such orders, issued in haste or under pressure, could unintentionally erode the very freedoms they claimed to protect. She did not accuse the judge of malice. That would have been too easy, too political. Instead, she made it clear that the system had failed not because of bad actors, but because of unchecked assumptions. And those assumptions had allowed power to drift into dangerous territory. The gallery had gone still again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This silence was reverent, tense, almost reverent. People were no longer watching a performance. They were witnessing an event, a shift, a rupture in the normal order of things. Every word Karoline spoke seemed to echo beyond the courtroom, as if reverberating into something larger. She was no longer simply defending her client. She was reclaiming space that had been denied to people like her. People without the right background, the right credentials, the right connections. And as she approached her closing sequence, her tone did not rise, but it sharpened. She laid out the timeline of the case, showed how the journalist had exhausted all legal avenues before publishing, how his work had exposed a legitimate issue of public concern. She contrasted that against the prosecution's narrative, which now looked fragile, overreaching, and driven more by optics than justice. She highlighted every inconsistency, every conflict of interest, every red flag that had been ignored or concealed until now. And she did it with the composure of someone who understood the full weight of what she was saying and what it meant to say it here, in this room, in front of the very people who had tried to keep her out. By the time she paused, the prosecution had no rebuttal prepared. The lead attorney, once smug and unbothered, sat with a pen in hand but didn't write. His face had changed, not from embarrassment, but from recognition. He knew, as everyone else did, that the foundation of his case had been hollowed out. He had walked into the courtroom expecting to defeat an unqualified interloper. Instead, he had been methodically dismantled by someone who knew the system better than he did, and more importantly, who respected it more than he ever had. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but contemplative. He was not used to being challenged in this way, especially not by someone outside the fold. But the facts had been laid bare, the contradictions exposed, the consequences implied. It was not just a legal defeat being orchestrated before him, it was a moral one. And Karoline had delivered it without gloating, without raising her voice, without ever needing to declare victory. Her strength was in the precision of her argument, in the calm certainty of her presence, and in the unmistakable truth that she was not there to play by the rules of performance. She was there to restore meaning to the rules themselves. And though no one said it aloud, everyone in the room felt the same unspoken truth. She had won. Not just the argument, not just the moment. She had won the respect of the room. She had shifted the power dynamic in a space that had been engineered to exclude her. And she had done it by being better, more prepared, more principled, more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. There was no applause when Karoline finished, no dramatic declaration of victory, no raised voices, no camera flashes lighting up the room. The silence that followed her final words was heavier than anything spoken, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had just occurred. The courtroom, once brimming with condescension and self-assured authority, now felt subdued, almost reverent. People shifted in their seats not to get comfortable, but to find their bearings again, like passengers on a vessel that had quietly changed direction without warning. Karoline remained standing for a moment, not out of pride or anticipation, but to honor the gravity of what had just been said. Her breathing was even, her hands still resting calmly at the table. She did not look to the judge for validation. She did not glance at the prosecutor for a reaction. Her eyes scanned the room not as a performer seeking response, but as an observer, taking measure of a moment that no one could fully articulate yet. The kind of moment that, years later, would still feel like a turning point, even if no one could agree on when exactly the tide had shifted. The judge cleared his throat, a quiet, human sound that felt out of place in the thick silence. He spoke with a voice that had noticeably lost its edge. The tone was measured, almost neutral, as he addressed procedural elements, next steps, document submissions, a possible adjournment to review evidence. But beneath his words was something new, something that had not been there before. Restraint. It was the tone of a man who had been confronted with something undeniable, something that would follow him far beyond the boundaries of this case. He did not praise her, nor did he scold her, but he no longer dismissed her, and that, in this place, was everything. Karoline responded only when necessary, her answers precise and respectful. She knew the weight of silence now worked in her favor, that her power was no longer in words but in what remained after them. The opposing counsel remained seated, his notes untouched. His earlier confidence had dissipated into a kind of distant awareness, not of defeat, that would come later, in reports and internal memos, but of exposure. He had seen what happened when someone stepped into a space they weren't invited to and didn't just hold their ground, but redefined it. That awareness would linger longer than any loss. It would become part of his memory of this room, impossible to scrub clean. The defendant, quiet throughout the proceedings, sat straighter now. His eyes no longer searched the room for signs of pity or skepticism. He was no longer just a man on trial. He was the recipient of a defense that had become a symbol. And though he might never fully grasp the depth of what had happened around him, he understood enough to know that the person who stood beside him had not only believed in his case, but had fought for it with a kind of courage that went beyond legal technicality. She had exposed something larger, about systems, about power, about truth, and done it with such quiet precision that even those most committed to ignoring her had been forced to listen. As the hearing drew to a close, people began to stir, journalists gathering their things, clerks collecting papers, observers whispering with new energy. The air in the room had changed. It was no longer filled with the confidence of authority, but with the buzzing uncertainty that follows disruption. No one quite knew what would happen next, but they all knew that whatever came, it would happen differently because of what they had witnessed. Something had been introduced into the system that could not be easily removed, a presence, a question, a precedent. Karoline gathered her papers slowly, without rush, folding them back into the same slim folder she had brought with her. She didn't need to linger. Her purpose had been served. She wasn't waiting for recognition, and she didn't care for spectacle. She had never been there for that. She walked toward the exit with the same calm purpose she had carried when she arrived, and yet everyone noticed her leaving. Heads turned, conversations paused. Even the judge glanced up one more time as the door opened and closed behind her. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was brighter, the overhead lights sharp after the dim weight of the chamber. Reporters were already waiting, some with cameras ready, others with notepads in hand, but none of them rushed her. They simply watched, trying to read something in her face, searching for a soundbite, a gesture, anything that would explain what had just happened. But she offered nothing. No smile, no statement, just a nod to the defendant, still following behind her, and a steady pace down the corridor. Later there would be headlines, some dramatic, some understated. Legal blogs would parse her arguments. Social media would fragment the footage into clips and quotes. Commentators would debate whether what she had done was brilliant, reckless, or unprecedented. But none of that mattered to Karoline. The only thing that mattered was that she had told the truth, in the one place where it was hardest to speak, and she had done so without permission. The consequences would ripple outward. Judges would read transcripts. Young clerks would share videos. Law students would quote her in papers. She wouldn't be invited into the institutions she had challenged, but she would live in the margins of their influence, shaping thought, sharpening resistance. And for those who had been in that room, who had watched the transformation unfold, not of a case but of a presence, they would never again look at someone like her with the same dismissive eyes. She had not changed the system in one day. She hadn't expected to, but she had cracked its surface. She had shown that knowledge, clarity, and courage could pierce through assumption and arrogance. And she had done it all not with rage, not with power, but with something far more difficult to challenge: unshakable conviction. And as she stepped out into the daylight, surrounded by people who didn't yet know whether they should cheer or stay silent, Karoline Leavitt simply kept walking. She didn't need the noise. The silence she had left behind was louder than anything they could say.